Well, to exclude the possibility of some sort of supranatural, suprahuman, and possibly supernatural intelligence causation is to a priori rule out what may be a very plausible explanation of some evidence. How does the critic know that miracles do not happen? The critic may argue, like David Hume, for the uniformity of human experience against miracles, a circular argument that excludes the evidence of the claims supposedly under consideration and others claim it. I know they don't exist because miracles aren't possible. Well, I'm giving you an example of a miracle. Well, I know that can't be a miracle because miracles aren't possible. Well, again, I'm giving you an orange and you're saying oranges don't exist. So you're not going to be able to accept any evidence, right? There's nothing short of you going against your own mind to make you admit that that's the case. Or the critic may contend from an atheistic standpoint that one knows that God or other suprahuman intelligences do not exist and hence cannot provide a source of supernatural phenomenon. So this is a miracle. Well, miracles may be possible, but I know that it can't be from God. Okay, where does it come from? Well, it can't be from God. So this is just something that happens that we don't have an explanation for. That could also be the case. So you're admitting to the phenomenon, but you're saying, well, let's just give it a little bit of time and we'll figure out a cause that will be useful and explanatory under my presuppositional worldview.
Right. So how our critics know miracles don't exist? First, well, because experience shows that miracles don't exist. Well, that's the question that we're asking. Does experience show that miracles exist? So when you say because experience, it goes against experience, well, you're begging the question. That's a circular kind of thing, right? So that's the first one. The other one is, well, because God doesn't exist. Right. Well, again, you have to show that. You just can't make that as a claim, right? So those are the two issues that he wants us to see there. He says more reasonably, though, outside of those two particular issues, the critic may argue that since there is no consensus about God's existence, a critic is excused from considering this as a cause. So there's no consensus, there's disagreement, and therefore we don't have to, allow God to be causally connected to this particular phenomenon. Yet he says historians offer hypotheses about all sorts of causes on which there is no consensus. So just because there's no consensus doesn't mean that you can't talk about a cause, right? He says historians do that all the time. He says, but even if the historian reasonably decides not to pronounce judgment on causation, it does not logically follow that one may say that such a historian has disproved divine causation, or that any historical evidence has ruled out such causation. All we can say is they decided not to talk about it. That doesn't mean that it's ruled out or they disproved it, right? He says to make such a claim is entirely circular, consulting nothing more than a restatement of the presuppositions with which one began the discussion.
Right. And it's one in contention as well. Moving on to Hume's argument from nature, as many scholars today note, anti-supernaturalism is little more than a presupposition. It's rarely argued, and it's rarely seeking to marshal evidence. It just, if you're a historian, if you're working in these fields, then you better be anti-supernaturalism, because why are you even here? Why are you doing science if you believe that there's the possibility of something outside of science? Well, that just is the presupposition in question here. And again, he says it's rarely argued and rarely to be presented as evidence. You are just supposed to be that. Well, 17th and 18th century rational philosophy, rather than any specific evidence, is largely responsible for the usual summary dismissal of beliefs in supernatural phenomenon in modern academy. So we hearken back to, well, it's always been this way, well, at least 17th and 18th century. So, we've got a good track record so far.
Right. And so what he does here is he kind of lays out who really one of the most influential philosophers and thinkers who talked about this. He says more influentially than most earlier thinkers, 17th century philosopher Benedict de Spinoza, right? So Spinoza argued that miracles are self-contradictory. Why? Well, it was based on his monistic identification of God with the natural order. So the natural order is God, right? So how the nature works is how God works. And so God doesn't do things extraordinary beyond nature because that's not, who God is and how he works, because how nature works is how God works. And so Spinoza viewed laws of nature as, notice, identical with God. or God's will. Thus, on his approach, if any miracle reports are true, they must have naturalistic explanations not yet discovered, an approach that has persisted, right? And so that's what you were explaining earlier. Well, it has to have a naturalistic explanation, right? Spinoza said it has to have it's not a miracle. It's the way God works if the event happened, because that's, how nature works is how God works, because God is nature, right? Or at least part of how things works. So Spinoza viewed miracles, as noticed, self-contradictory, because he believes that the divine nature is identical with natural law. And so everything that happens is how God is doing things, because natural law is who God is, and that's how he works. So there's no extraordinary or beyond natural laws, because everything that happens is part of natural law.
It's pretty impressive that you can just define out your contention. So, when it comes to the resurrection, well, Jesus, he drank a healing potion and he rolled a natural 20. And so he was able to bounce back. Whatever natural thing that causes him to get better, that must be the explanation, because, again, we cut off our leg and we say, well, at least I don't have athlete's foot. Yet if one does not rule out the existence of a single intelligent source like God of most theists, theism offers a particularly useful rational explanation. If with most theists one attributes the origin of the universe to divine causation, one can argue by analogy that divine activity on a smaller scale, even in events involving the creation of new matter and energy, is a priori plausible. And again, just today, I was going over the laws of thermodynamics with a few kids that I teach. And pretty much, if you follow the laws of thermodynamics, it's impossible to have an atheistic point of view with those. And of course, you can tweak those rules as well. And not saying that atheists don't have an answer for it, but as it stands, as it sits, you have to either make special pleading to things, outside the normal rules, or you have, a given moment in which you can say, well, this had to happen first, and then you were able to have the laws of thermodynamics follow the normal ways. But it definitely couldn't be God. You couldn't have an intelligent come in and start that off and then still have that. That's entirely impossible. But you have to have something so small that nothing explodes and creates everything. So that's science. But to say an intelligent being outside of the system can put in those things into effect, well, then you're just crazy talk, and we can't even consider that. So Spinoza's naturalism helped set the default approach for later naturalistic methodology and the conclusions it was designed to achieve. So he kind of kicked it off. It wasn't quite Hume, it was Spinoza. And then he said, well, let's define out, the biblical Christian God, and just say, well, God could exist, but he's definitely just the laws of nature themselves. So it's kind of like pantheism approach to who God is, or at least a somewhat deist approach. Yeah.
Yeah. It's more pantheism than deism. Yeah.
Right.